Know if you get it.
Yeah.
Oh, there you go. Okay.
So
Okay, sorry about that. I'm going to start over so that we have everything in the recording. Good afternoon and welcome to our webinar. I'm very excited that you're joining us. My name is Erin Meyer. I am the founder and executive director of Basil's Harvest. And our mission at Basil's Harvest is to promote human and planetary well-being by engaging the power of local regenerative food systems. And we achieve this two ways. Our first way that we achieve this is we convene leaders across food systems, farms, institutions, and healthcare to foster strategic and collaborative ecosystems that can bring about shorter regenerative value chains. Right now, we are working with the Minnesota and Illinois National Guard to help them find pathways to get locally grown food to feed the service men and women. The second way that we work towards our mission is that we support research and we curate experiential learning experiences to increase food system, farming, institution, and healthcare industry awareness between the connections of soil health, nutrient quality, and health outcomes. Through this work, we are seeing a movement emerge, a movement where medicine, agriculture, and food systems unite, a movement that envisions transforming our agricultural system to transform human health. Through this work, we believe that planetary health is achievable through a regenerative food system. We all believe that a regenerative food system can heal our planet through healthier soil, improved water quality, and greater carbon sequestration, that we can sustainably feed urban and rural communities, and that we will improve community health, wealth, and a well-being of reinvesting into our local economies. Next slide, please. So today, you will be experiencing a story that highlights how Basil's Harvest has convened over the last 4 years. And 4 years ago, the story of healing from the ground up, I really believe it began during that time through a project where we were working with Rodale Institute and a farm, a processor, and a hospital to figure out a pathway of organic oats into that hospital. And we really started digging into soil health and the soil microbiome. And from there, we built relationships and we've brought professionals together to really work on this feedback loop of soil health connects to human health. And what you're going to experience today is a story of healing from the ground up. And I'm humbled by the team that has come together to do this. And I'm going to give you a brief introduction of each team member. And this story begins with Anya Knecht. And Anya is a farmer. She is the assistant director of I-Regen at the University of Illinois. I can refer to Anya as my boss because she is who I report to through some of our projects that we're working on with research and education outreach. Anya has cystic fibrosis, and she learned at a very, very young age the importance of not only nutrition, but she was starting to connect the dots with how food was grown and the health of her soil where her food was being grown in. And as I said, I am humbled that she is sharing this story with you. It's deeply personal, and we want to highlight her and give her the space to share this story. And as we were building out this platform for this talk and imagining what could this look like, we started thinking, how do we connect the dots? Well, the next step is let's go to the ground and start with the soil. And Dr. Carl Rosier and I have been working together for over 4 years. He was the soil scientist that designed our soil study with our Farm to Institution project. And we've maintained and grown our professional relationship and our friendship through this period. And he's going to take you on the journey of the intricacies of soil, the soil microbiome, and what it might connect to, what we know it connects to, and a lot of things that we're guessing that we think it could connect to. So I'm really excited to have Carl share his research and what he's learned through these steps. Following Carl, Dr. Jasia Steinmetz from the University of Wisconsin, Stevens Point, is going to take us through nutrition, food systems, and community engagement. And what we're trying to do is create connections to Anya's story on how she's figured out in maintaining her health through her chronic illness, how soil and food is helping to keep her going in her life. And so we brought Carl and Jasia in to continue that conversation and to help build some of these bridges. And then following each speaker, we're going to open it up to questions. So thank you again for joining us. You're about to experience 90 minutes of a heartfelt conversation. And I am going to pass it on to Anya.
All right. Thank you, Erin. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Okay, awesome. All right. Thank you for the introduction. And I'll go ahead and dive in with a little bit of my background and what got me to where I am today. Next slide. All right. So I grew up farming both conventionally and regeneratively. And I did gardening, canning, food preservation, all of which was with my parents and my grandparents. And thankfully, my mom had done extensive research in nutrition and has a degree in soil science and is also a nurse. And I wouldn't be alive today if it weren't for her teaching me at a young age how to care for my body and to not pollute it. She taught me a decision tree to be able to discern what's important and how to make the necessary steps when advancing through a problem. The other side of my family is made up of engineers who spent their free time on the side refining gardening to an equation in an urban setting. And so I reap the benefits of both by eating fresh produce, playing in the dirt, hauling grain, building things, and learning the ins and outs of farming, both urban and rural. After that, I spent 10 years helping run, design, and administer research at the Beckman Institute for Advanced Science and Technology at the University of Illinois under Director Art Kramer, where we investigated what exercise, nutrition, and aging does to the brain. And I employed these in my principles every day. I would get up and run miles in the morning, and then I'd pack a crock pot of farm-raised produce and food to bring into the lab members and feed them that as my guinea pigs because I needed them to stay happy, healthy, and capable. And they didn't mind being the guinea pigs. They gave it the name Lead and Feed. And I enjoyed that very much. We did everything from video game training to exercise studies to nutrition to dance to eye tracking, lots of MRIs, many intervention studies, all of which were on aging brains with population demographics that were from 7 years old to 85 years old. And they had a lot of different attributes such as chemotherapy and then normal populations as well. Before that, I conducted experiments in human factors engineering and human perception and performance and our affinity with technology in those systems. And for those of you who are unfamiliar with that line of work, it shows up the most in places such as aviation, medicine, and agriculture, because when something goes wrong in those fields, it's oftentimes fatal. So for example, in aviation, if the landing gear gets retracted as you're going up for your approach, that causes a major accident. Or in medicine, if the wrong leg gets amputated, let's say, that's another big problem. In agriculture, if you keep shredding augers on light poles, that's another issue. So human factors engineers assess these systems through a human usability lens and identify where that breakdown occurred, whether it's mechanical, communication, or some lack of affinity with the human or the controls that a human uses. So they redesign it to address these. After this, I moved to the agricultural sector and started working with the Institute for Sustainability, Energy, and Environment, which is IC. And I was managing multiple projects from the Center for Advanced Bioenergy and Bioproducts Innovation, also known as CABI, a couple of ARPA-E projects and a few NSF projects. And now I'm the assistant director, as Erin mentioned, for I-Regen. And I do grant writing and research development and design on the side through my LLC. So I had to make use of all of that knowledge for soil, nutrition, engineering, gardening, and all of it in fairly short order because I have a life-threatening illness called cystic fibrosis. And for those of you who are unfamiliar with the disease, I'll give you a quick rundown of what it's like to live with CF. Next slide, please. All right, so cystic fibrosis affects about 70,000 worldwide, 30,000 in the United States. It is a chronic, excuse me. It is a chronic, progressive, and fatal genetic inherited disease to which there is no cure at present. When I was born, the life expectancy for a person with CF was 14. Today it is 37 for those who were born before 2017. The current life expectancy for patients born after 2017 is about 50 to 53, and that's due to new medications and antibiotics. But for those of us who were born before 2017, the damage incurred to the organs keeps the life expectancy around 37.5. So as you can see here in the image, cystic fibrosis occurs because there is a defective gene or mutation, and that's within the cystic fibrosis transmembrane conductance regulator, or the CFTR gene. And what happens is it changes the protein that regulates the movement of the salt in and out of the cells. And that results in every membrane in the body being affected by a very thick and sticky mucus on every surface. And the consequences are usually showing up in your respiratory system, your digestive system, and your reproductive systems. And you also have an increased salt content to your sweat. So if anyone sees me on a hot day, I have a certain shine to me because I am layered with salt crystals. Anyway, that membrane also regulates calcium, potassium, and chloride going in and out of the cell. With cystic fibrosis, there are different defects in that transporter. And so depending on your genetic mutation, that is associated with a different level of severity of the condition. All right, next slide. Okay, so how does cystic fibrosis affect the body? Let's start with the lungs. So in the lungs, the mucus clogs the airways and it traps the bacteria, leading to infections and extensive lung damage and eventually respiratory failure. The same mucus that clogs your lungs is also present in your sinuses. So it pretty much feels like having pneumonia constantly, or a continuous head cold or chest cold. And so you spend time constantly clearing that mucus out or coughing. And I remember when I was in high school, I would come home after working as a waitress late at night, and I would be so hungry, I would eat an entire box of Raisin Bran, but I couldn't taste any of it because I had already lost my sense of smell and taste due to that thick congestion in my nasal passages, which leaves Raisin Bran a little less gratifying. Anyway, for me, I realized early on when I was at school that coughing is fairly disruptive. So I became conditioned to suppress it when I was in meetings or in public as much as possible. And now that we've all experienced COVID, there's no doubt everyone here has felt the stink eye from across the room when you're coughing, and others feel like you're exposing them to your germs. So when I traveled during COVID, I almost had a t-shirt made that said, "It's not COVID, it's cystic fibrosis, and I'm not contagious." Anyway, when I suppress my coughing, I can often feel it pooling in my lungs. And I know all too well that later on, I'm going to have to spend time clearing that out with treatments. And so what do treatments look like for cystic fibrosis patients? A lot of times that includes a percussive airway clearance device or a vest, and I'll have a picture of it later in my slides. But basically it beats your chest and vibrates it so that patients can mobilize that mucus and get it out of their lungs. So this treatment, coupled with nebulized bronchial dilators, which opens up your airways, and inhaled antibiotics, those are the daily regimen for patients, and it takes anywhere from 3 to 5 hours per day. Thankfully, due to my support group, I have a mobile form of the vest, and I take this everywhere I go, basically. And it's clunky. It's the size of a suitcase, and I take that everywhere along with my lunch bag, which is filled with about 20 pounds of food. So why the 20 pounds of food? Unfortunately, the pancreas is affected as well, and being that it's both endocrine and exocrine, this causes problems for being able to absorb your food. So the duct that allows the release of digestive enzymes into your intestines to break down your food and absorb those vital nutrients is clogged permanently. That means that everything that I eat, I have to take enzymes with in order to absorb any of it. And let me tell you, when things don't get digested, it's very painful. It causes a lot of damage and eventually scar tissue in your intestines. And that happens because, say, you forget to take your enzymes, or you get the wrong ratio for whatever food you're eating, or you get the wrong timing and you take it just slightly too late or too early for whatever meal you're trying to have. Anyway, the pancreas is also producing insulin. And so over time, your pancreas starts to have more problems and incur the damage. And your body needs that pancreas to split out insulin into your bloodstream so that your body can use the sugar and convert it into energy. So with the increased complications, eventually most CF patients have CF-related diabetes. So since I cannot digest my food without enzymes, I had to learn a lot about nutrition early on. And with the help of my mom, I gradually trained my taste palette and my behaviors to match what my body needed. Eventually, I learned how to make those foods more desirable in preparation, better taste, better taste, and better food chemistry. So, other organs that are also affected include your liver, where the bile duct can become inflamed and blocked. And then reproductively, almost all men with cystic fibrosis are infertile because the tube that connects the testes to the prostate gland, or the vas deferens, is either blocked with mucus or entirely missing. For women with CF, they're less fertile because a lot of times that thick cervical mucus makes it so nothing can get through. And we all know how babies are made. And also the fallopian tubes can get plugged. So over time, due to the constant need to clear out the mucus out of the lungs, the heart also can incur the damage. And it develops what's called pulmonary hypertension from that increased stress that's put on the heart. And so the heart wasn't meant to run a marathon forever, and eventually right side heart failure can occur. All right, next slide here. Okay, so I included this slide just to give a good graphic of all the different things that can be related to these organs failing at various times in your lifespan. Next slide. Okay, so I won't go through all of these, but with every organ being affected, you can imagine how there are a mirage of daily symptoms. And so every day, anything from coughing up mucus and lots of blood to intense digestive problems to diabetes to electrolyte imbalance to the long-term consequences on your bones and your heart. All those things in one body, it's a lot to do all at once. So since that thick mucus ends up clogging your lungs and your sinuses, patients often undergo what's called intensive IV or intravenous antibiotic treatments throughout their life, and that's to keep the infections under control. So all that mucus harbors a lot of bacteria. And so just like in our environment, those antibiotics prove less and less effective over time because bacteria gain resistance and they mutate. So these IV ROMs are very similar to chemotherapy. They have parallel side effects, which I could give you a list, but most people know what it's like to go through a chemotherapy round and the nausea and diarrhea and everything else that comes with that. But basically that's because it kills everything in your body, and that includes the good bacteria. All right, next slide. Okay, so as you can imagine, there's significant time commitment that goes into maintaining this disease and navigating the medical system. Just before COVID, there was a film that came out called 5 Feet Apart, and I would recommend it to anyone because it is a really good exposure to what it's like to live with cystic fibrosis. But the lead actress has CF, of course, and mentions that by the age of 13, oftentimes CF patients have become their own doctor because they've put that much knowledge into staying alive. And so for patients that do 3 to 4 hours of treatments per day, and that's not including IVs or the extra effort to stay alive, a lot of patients come up with their own intrinsic agency to get themselves up and clear out their lungs every single day and eat enough food to make sure that they can keep up with the caloric intensive need. And probably what holds us most accountable is not being dead. So I'd like to think that if one day there was a cure and I could put that energy, that amount of energy that I do into staying alive every day, I would be Captain Marvel. Plus, as many of my friends and family would attest to, I could probably get hit by a bus and still get up and walk away just to do the next thing in life. There's a scene in Captain Marvel where she gets knocked down repeatedly, only to get back up every time, and finally she breaks free. This resonates with how I feel every day. For me, facing death repeatedly throughout life and being told that I will not see the next year's horizons, I've lived life a bit differently. And thankfully, I spent a good portion of my early life being in denial and stubbornly moving forward with achievements, determined not to let CF ever stop me. And I very much owe it to my support group, especially my mom and my brother, because they have carried the weight of this with me. And for those who are Lord of the Rings fans, the parallel that I like to draw is that it's like Frodo carrying that ring. He's the only one that can carry the ring, but the trusted few who help him get through the challenges, help him make it to the end. All right. So why does all of this matter? This is probably the first time I've ever spoken in public about the disease, because I also realized that if someone with these symptoms I was experiencing every day said what these symptoms are every day to someone, it would get old really fast. Not to mention, it's hard to believe that a body can actually keep going under these circumstances. So when I was in 8th grade, I broke my hip mid-sprint during a track meet, and that started me down a path of journaling. And I had to document all of my physical therapy just to get myself back up to walking and everything that came with that. Turns out, journaling progressed into a really great outlet. I ended up journaling all of the pain and the symptoms, and it gave me a place to put that wasn't necessarily in conversation. And so that became what was a book of data. I started to document everything from the exercise I did to the foods I ate, to my acidity balance or my pH, to my hormones, to my activities, medications, environments, etc. And so it became basically my preliminary data work. Next slide. So as the disease progresses, I realized that if I was going to stay alive with this, I would have to engineer the shit out of it. I began my search for answers when I recognized how my mom used to teach me things. She would start with the thing we were trying to accomplish, and then she would tell me everything she knows to be true so far about the topic and how we got there. This generated a system for me, essentially building a decision tree, or rather connecting points. I like to think of this as my human factors engineering brain, calling it the connect theory. And this works under the assumption that everything is connected. So I started to build these connecting points between soil, food, farm, and health, because when I began to teach others why I did what I did, I would inevitably work backwards through the decision tree made up of all of these dynamic connections. And so much like a farmer has to wear many hats to accomplish their job, from being the bookkeeper to the agronomist to the mechanic to the CEO who decides when to go, I had to do the same, being my own nurse, dietitian, soil scientist, and more. Next slide. So as I mentioned before, I have to take enzymes with everything I eat. So when I was young, I started to wonder what happens if for some reason I cannot get those enzymes I need. And much like the concerns that we have today, we've all witnessed during COVID with supply chains that this is potentially an ongoing problem. This helped me discover that you can actually digest your foods by coupling them with certain foods that have naturally occurring enzymes to help digest other foods. So for example, I eat tons of honey, which not only has antibacterial properties, but also has natural enzymes. Other things that I include in my diet of many are things like raisins, bananas, avocados, kefir, yogurt, sauerkraut, pineapples, ginger, and more. All of those things have naturally occurring enzymes and do a lot more for your immune system and your body. In fact, many of the things that we eat like that can buffer your organs and mitigate existing symptoms like inflammation or diabetes or heart disease. So diets that build resilience and diversity and complement your body's needs can protect your organs and also affect your bacterial profile. And that bacterial profile translates into better brain health and better processing and better cellular regeneration. So if all the cells in my body repair themselves using the food I ingest, and I would think that the cells that I want in my body are made out of spinach, not fries. So additionally, when I eat spinach that I buy from a mass producing outlet that has been transported thousands of miles to get to me, I don't get nearly as much substance or nutritional quality as I do if I pick that spinach from my own backyard. And so I noticed that my body doesn't assimilate it as readily if it's from some place that's practically foreign to my body. And so there is a familiarity factor for your body being able to ingest something that's made up of the soils that you live in and breathe around every day. So purchasing from the local food shed region is not only going to support your community, but the produce generated carries properties such as bacteria and phytochemicals that helps your body's immune system and its needs. And so these are things that I won't cover because I'm out of time, but Carl and Jasia will later in more detail. So if you are what you eat, what does your food eat? Next slide. So let's go through the connections. If your produce comes from the soil and you eat the produce and you are what you eat, then it matters what you put in your bodies and in our soils. The best mechanism to building healthy soils and healthy people is to create a hospitable host environment for microorganisms, biodiversity, and resilience. Not depleting those pools has been really essential for my survival. Next slide. So I've survived because my lungs have kind of created their own ecosystem. While I'm often in uncharted territory, actually most of the time, and the doctors theorize along with me, that the bacteria I harbor keeps everything at bay. They kind of give each other a competition, or they learn to coexist together, or they even create their own symbiotic relationship, depending on what my body has to offer as the host. So some of the bacteria that's very concerning for CF patients that often gets harbored in the lungs and causes damage eventually are actually naturally occurring in the environment. So just to name a few, Pseudomonas aeruginosa, Burkholderia cepacia, MRSA or methicillin-resistant Staphylococcus aureus, MAC or Mycobacterium avium complex. Those are just a few that you'll find in our soils all the time, or in other environments such as fertilizer or manure. So oddly enough, many of these bacteria that are great are also great for plants. In fact, in California, they started to spray B. cepacia on fields until somebody notified them that it would probably kill 30,000 people. So they banned it. But Pseudomonas also has properties that can promote plant growth by suppressing pathogenic microorganisms and synthesizing growth stimulating plant hormones and promoting increased plant disease resistance. Those are all things that Pseudomonas can do for a plant. And in fact, my brother is a commercial farmer who treats seeds before they go into the ground. And every time when I go over and I pick up one of those bottles, we always compare what the mix of agents are that coats the seeds, because often enough, some of those things that he's putting on a seed is actually something that I also culture in my lungs. But without that diversity, I wouldn't be alive. And so when I go out and I dig in the garden, I'm getting all of those things that help keep my ecosystem where it needs to be. So over the course of my lifetime, I've gone through 21 IV rounds, and those are all very corrosive and caustic antibiotics. And it's kind of like going into the hospital to give yourself a little Roundup treatment. And I can tell you that the first thing to go from experience is your intestinal tract lining. So all of that great microbial flora that your intestines have to help you digest your food and get those nutrients and keep you in a good state and your immune system, that goes straight through you. And much like our soils, if there's no microbes and certainly no microbiome present to uptake all of those nutrients that go into it, then all of that has no adhering agent or binding agent. And so it gets peed out the other side, or in the case of our environment, it goes into our waterways. So this has implications for our environment in many directions, definitely in soil erosion, runoff, and in increasing the hypoxic zone, depending on how much fertilizer we put on. But all that are all those things are things Carl and Jasia will cover a little bit more later on. So I've learned to build a buffer in this through making conscious choices about how to keep that intestinal microbial flora going, such as using yogurt, probiotics, or things like that to replace that natural flora. Now, the reality is there is no way to avoid needing to use highly caustic, noxious materials in the time scale that we need to at present. So that's not going to pencil out economically for a farmer, and certainly not mortality-wise for a CF patient. So there's no way I could stand up here and preach to you the impossible or give you advice that doesn't match reality. Next slide. But what I can do is tell you to work with what you've got. For me, I have a small 10-acre farm where I try to employ that circularity and holistic management practices. And almost everything I do connects to one another and has a dual purpose or more. So, for example, the pollinator mix attracts the bees and the birds and the butterflies. And in turn, all of those bees that pollinate the orchard, and the nut trees provide food for me and for the birds and the squirrels. And the chickens and the rabbits provide a really nice, stable source of fertilizer. So I can put that on the garden and work it into the soil every year to keep that soil really healthy. And I get to minimize my food waste from the kitchen, because chickens are like the pigs of the 80s. So they eat everything. And even the wood that I burn in the winter, I repurpose that by putting it on the garden and spreading it for more potash and potassium content. And that ensures, all of that ensures that the garden and the berries and the orchard, all those soils that those live in are not depleted, and they're full of vital nutrients for the plant every season. And the soil has a high microbial content, which helps with that soil aggregation that you need in order to ensure that the produce has more phytochemicals and nutritional content. I also have a pasture, and that's made up of timothy grass, clover, and alfalfa. And that supplies a local farmer for food for his cattle. And it also provides a lot of forage for my beehives. And so even though this is a small plot of land, to me, it works because it helps to mitigate climate change. It helps keep my soil rich and the profile holding more carbon, more nitrogen, more nutrients, and better soil organic matter, which is simultaneously helping me stay alive. So every farmer here knows farming is a very active life, which is part of why I bought the farm. I knew that I would need something to keep me continually clearing my lungs out, and I need a lot of sun. So one thing I wanted to mention for sure is that I think, as we all know, our population as a whole is vitamin D deficient. But for CF patients, they're notoriously low in vitamin D, but we can't take supplements as well to supplement that vitamin D need because that doesn't get absorbed. So the best way I've found to get the vitamin D that I need is to make like a solar panel, go outside and soak it up. But just as an example of the connectedness, if I don't get enough vitamin D or you don't get enough vitamin D, our intestines can only absorb about 10% of the calcium. So over time, that translates into issues with your bones, for example. So if my soil and my body are conduits to change, then I want to make sure that I have all the information I can so that when my farm is hit with fire blight, say, or the climate change induced severe thunderstorms, or say my body has to go in for a round of IV treatment or a roundup or a cleanup treatment, I'm in the best position possible to be able to address all the problems that might arise in that space. Okay, next slide. Okay, so for those of you who are Family Guy fans, you'll recognize the phrase, "Damn nature, you scary." So nature can be scary, and my margin of error in addressing those issues has decreased over time, as is ours on a worldwide basis. But over time, when trying to figure out what to do with the variety of bacteria that I contract and harbor in my lungs, I began to learn that each one has its own unique way. So some bacteria mutate rapidly, others learn to eat penicillin for lunch, such as Burkholderia cepacia, or it creates a biofilm that makes it almost impenetrable for antibiotics to reach it. And others like high estrogen or high progesterone environments. And others yet they're just really smart and they trick your immune system into working against you. That bacteria and the microbiome in our soils and our bodies, they live at a different time scale and different things than we do, obviously. And so that gives them the advantage in some ways in being adaptable. So for me, being the catalyst of my own survival, I had to learn about all these connections and how to apply it. To me, everything comes full circle. So to every protagonist, there's an antagonist. However, it's up to us to keep that balance through implementing and keeping those solutions around through biodiversity. This isn't rocket science, but managing holistically means understanding as much as you can about a system to address problems when they arise. And keeping that biodiversity in there pretty much gives us the margin of error that we need in order to figure out how to address those issues when they come up. Next slide. All right, so let's go back to the beginning and humor me for a minute here. So let's just say for a second that the heralded laws of physics still apply today, that matter is neither created nor destroyed, and for every action, there is an equal and opposite reaction. To me, that sounds like balance. So if everything is connected, then perhaps we should focus on how it is all connected to make more informed decisions about how to achieve that balance. We think the laws of physics don't apply to social sciences and behaviors, but they do. That's why we have the saying, all is fair in love and war. Even with trust and human connections, everything balances out and comes full circle. It's at different levels and times, but if we can start to quantify those connections that we all know exist, we'll be better able to address things in the future. Next slide. All right, so I love this photo because truly everyone goes through things differently. Everyone has their challenges. Whether you are a child with diabetes, you're a healthcare administrator, you're a farmer who provides our food, you are a link in this chain of connections. Next slide. Okay, yep, that one. So if we're going to survive, and if we're going to survive, we have to understand that system. Starting by connecting to your own system is one thing that's great that you can do. The biodiversity and the microbiome in our soils and our bodies give us that ability to adapt, an ability to survive and thrive. So buy local, go talk to a farmer. They really do know their shit. Manage holistically. That pretty much means, you know, finding those connections and building a decision tree from there, understanding the mechanisms and the different perspectives, and more information that you have on each of those connections, the more capable you are of making an informed decision. So one of my good friends and I were talking the other day that it's pretty much similar to buying a car. You consider different things now in the decision tree than you did 20 years ago. But for buying a car when you were 20, you know, you might have been concerned at the time about the cool factor or the color or how to get the girl. But now you have different decisions. You have kids, you have a wheelchair to put in the back, and you have to travel 30 miles to get into work instead of 5. So fuel economy is a big thing. In other words, you have to make these connections and build your decision tree every day. Next slide. All right, so we may not be able to get rid of the use of Roundup, but what we can do is adapt by building biodiversity as a buffer. You can start by growing a small garden in your backyard or a planter box on your porch, or in your local community, finding a community garden to participate in, or going to farmers markets. Or say you're a farmer with plenty of commercial land, you could find a local FFA chapter or a school or a church that can help you by asking them to maintain just 1 acre of land that would help equip our youth with the knowledge, responsibility, accountability, and confidence and autonomy that comes with growing vegetables, which we all know happens. And it also builds that diversity into your farm. In general, I feel like we should be moving away from the attenuated experience and the sterile environment, and we should be rewarding behaviors that do not encourage complacency or redesigning or resigning ourselves to someone making those decisions for you. Continue to critically think through those connections, and that will help achieve balance. If someone asked me today if I would rather eat shit or drink bleach, I would say eat shit, because the microbial content is going to do a lot more for me than bleach. And it's the same with our lands. I would rather dump shit on that field than bleach it out so it has nothing left. If there is one thing I can press upon you, I would say do not let the rules that do not make sense handicap you from moving forward. Ask yourself in the face of change, does this make sense to do? If it doesn't, don't do it. If we keep living by metrics that were made in a different time using different decision points, we will impede our ability to adapt and change to a rapidly changing environment. And you'll end up with a Mustang instead of the minivan you needed. And finally, I encourage you to get involved in our workshop that we'll be hosting in the next year. And we'll be sending out information on that in the coming couple of months. Next slide. As for me, I'm on the journey to survive and thrive. This is only a small portion of what I do. I've completely left out my work in neuroscience and what good foods and exercise does for your brain, music, eating together in a community versus alone, home-cooked meals, the love and the non-sterile environment that produce enables, and the importance of animals in our lives. I added this photo here because I couldn't do it without my service dog, Sophie. And animals have a certain quality to them that I'm sure many people here can attest to. So if you're interested in more of what the Connect theory and how it applies to your work or your discipline, please reach out. And thank you so much for your time and attention. And now I'll pass the mic over to Carl.
Thanks, Anya. So I want to first start out by saying thank you for sharing your story with us. For me, it definitely puts a new perspective on the importance of how we produce food and who is able to utilize that food. So I really do appreciate that. I also also want to say thanks to the Illinois Stewardship Alliance for organizing and sponsoring the talk for us today. So, to get started, my name is Rosier. I'm a soil scientist. My background originally started, I became very interested in carbon and nitrogen dynamics within soils. I did a number of research projects in that arena. My interest then evolved to start to look at microorganisms and how they interact with plants, and the feedback between how microorganisms or how plants select their microbial community and how environment and those interactions and management can influence the structure of that community. That then evolved into a growing interest in how the soil environment, how we manage crops, and how the microorganisms that are present within that community then influences the nutrient content of food. So that kind of got me started. I've been working in that realm for a while. So I serve as the resident soil scientist for Basil's Harvest. And then in my free time, I co-founded a farm, a small acre vegetable farm with my son and a friend of his from high school, because we wanted to kind of practice what we preach as far as growing food goes. So initially it started out with that in mind. Then it became a platform to teach anybody in our region that was interested in growing food, a place where they could come and learn. And then that actually evolved into our work with our food insecure community. So a third of our market, we interact with communities that have to travel great distances to a grocery store, so they have food insecurity. My group, the guys bestowed upon me the title of operations director. Basically, that just means I tell them what piece of equipment they can't have, or what budget we're stuck with, or what markets we have to go to, or what we have to harvest that day. So with that said, I'll jump into my talk now. So next slide. Okay, so I figured let's start with a quick definition of what do we mean by the soil microbiome and what type of ecosystem services and plant services does it exactly provide. So just a quick definition, the plant microbiome or microbial community is a continuum of bacteria and fungi that are living in or around plant roots. There are approximately 1 billion soils in a teaspoon, 1 billion cells in a teaspoon of soil. And if we look for comparison, there's about 7.8 billion humans on the planet. So if we had 8 teaspoons of soil, that would outpace the population of our planet in just cells. Plants actually actively select their microbiome, and it's only under extreme abiotic stress that microbiome can be reduced or changed. An interesting question that we'll get into and talk a little bit about more is, what is the phylosphere? So there are actually microorganisms that live on the shoots and leaves of roots or plants as well. And those are also critically important to actually the plant's health and humans as part of our diet. So when we talk about ecosystem services, there are 4 that kind of resonate strongly with me because of my background, and I also think about how our planet is going to move forward. So the first one is carbon sequestration. So for every amount of plant biomass that enters the soil environment, microorganisms react on that, and approximately 90 to 95% of that is evolved back into the atmosphere as CO2. The remaining portion of that is incorporated into soil and becomes organic matter. Now, about 2/3 of that is actual plant biomass, and another third, depending on what soils you're looking at, is actually microbial biomass or necromass. So you have this, it's not just the plant biomass, but it's actually the activity of these microorganisms. So that organic matter then forms the basis of soil structure or aggregate structure. So as those aggregates form, they provide stability and carbon storage within the soil. Because of that, these aggregates form different environments or microcosms, and different types of organisms can live within that. So the structure of the soil actually increases biodiversity. So the more organic matter, the more structure, the more biodiversity. the more diverse, the more functionally capable the microbiome, the soil microbiome is. Another really important one is that microorganisms, especially the nitrogen fixers, convert atmospheric nitrogen to usable forms of nitrogen that plants can then take advantage of. But also this organic matter keeps that material, that form of nutrient from leaching from the soil. And this also comes into play with water holding capacity. So the greater the organic matter, the greater the structure, the greater the spore distribution, the more water that soil can actually hold. Now, when we turn to the services that are provided to the plant, one of them happens to be nutrient acquisition. So these nitrogen fixers that convert atmospheric nitrogen to useful forms for plants. There's also microorganisms or mycorrhizal fungi that solubilize phosphorus and actually bring it back to the plant root. Microorganisms can also assist in defense against pathogens in plants by forming these biofilms along the root, keep pathogens at bay. There's also microorganisms that can close the stomates of the leaves on the stomates on leaves, and that can decrease the hypopenetration into the plant. Also, that microorganisms and these biofilms that they produce can assist in loss of water. So we have greater water retention or greater ability to withstand drought when we have a diverse microbial environment. Okay, next slide. Okay, so conventional agricultural methods are not the most supportive of a robust soil microbiome. And what we mean here is just some of the management tactics that are used in that. So because we have intensive tillage that breaks those soil aggregates up, and that carbon that's maintained there has been mineralized and evolved back to the atmosphere, so we lose that structure. The application of pesticides, herbicides, and fertilizers, and even the long-term residues within there can reduce the microbial component of soil, so we have that loss of structure. The removal of crop biomass through harvesting removes armoring of the soil, so they're more prone to wind and rain erosion. And then on top of that, you have, so because of that, and then the lack of cover cropping. So when we don't cover crop and we leave the soil barren for long periods of time, you have these higher instances of wind and water erosion. Now, those we know are global problems. We see here in the lower panel the dead zone that gets created in the Gulf of Mexico every year because of the sediment and nitrogen pollution making its way down to the Gulf. Here on the East Coast, we actually see this as well. So I put up a picture of the Chesapeake Bay that has instances of the dead zone as well. The difference between the Chesapeake and the Gulf of Mexico is the proximity of farmers to the fishermen is much closer, and Maryland actually aggressively maintains and keeps the water quality challenges in their foresight. They have a very strong cover cropping program. In fact, when sediment and nutrient loads were very high coming in the Susquehanna, the government of the state legislature of Maryland was going to sue the state of Pennsylvania because they were not meeting the regulations that they needed to. So these are huge water quality issues. But on top of all that, we also see this reduction in microbial abundance and function. So we start to lose those microorganisms that provide all these great functions for both the plant and the environment. Okay, so next slide. So organic or regenerative agriculture approaches focus on creating a stable soil environment through management. And because of that, this increases microbial abundance. So this reduction in tillage or limited deep tillage event, you hold that soil structure in place to keep that carbon locked into those aggregates so they're not mineralized and reverted back to the atmosphere. Leaving the application of compost or the leaving of plant biomass on top of the soil surface that limits that impact of rain and wind erosion. The use of cover crops, which you see here, this is actually hairy vetch and red clover. Those are really great plants because they're legumes and they harbor nitrogen fixing microbes that convert that nitrogen gas into usable forms of nitrogen that the plant can then take advantage of. So because of these practices, we see increased soil structure, increased aggregate stability, increased soil stability, and we have a great reservoir of nutrients that are available to both the microorganisms that are present, but also the plants and the crops that we're trying to grow. So because of this, we see this increase in the soil microbial abundance and function. Okay, the next slide. Okay, so what is the state of our knowledge at this point regarding the soil microbial influence on crop quality? And I think of crop quality as a phytochemical concentration or abundance within the crop that humans are going to consume, or even animals are going to consume. This is what we know to date so far. Several studies suggest that the crop nutrient content continues to decline. And we've seen this over the last 20 to 30 years. We know that variability in crop antioxidant and protein content is likely linked to variety selection and management, and how this influences the soil environment. Several reports actually show negative effects of reductions in the soil microbial community, especially these nitrogen-fixing bacteria and mycorrhizal fungi as a result of glyphosate or Roundup application. A very nice study was done by Montgomery et al. I think a couple years ago. They did an excellent paired study across the U.S. comparing regenerative and conventional farms, and what they found is a greater mineral and phytochemical content in farms that were managed organically compared to conventional management. Hudner et al. Proposed that organic foods actually might provide greater organism resilience. So organisms that rely on an organic diet would actually be able to overcome the stress quicker, so that a shorter recovery time than those that don't. So with all this said, our knowledge is continuing to evolve, and more research and more effort is needed as we move forward to evolve our understanding or develop our understanding. Okay, so next slide, please. But the challenges actually continue with not only how we grow food, but how we move food. In conventional agriculture, a lot of the cultivar varieties are engineered for an early harvest, and they're also known as what we call an elite variety. So these are just a handful of varieties that they have. They're built to absorb fertilizer quickly, put on as much biomass as possible, and they're not as susceptible to either herbicide application or pesticide application. Now, what that means is it develops them for mechanical harvest. So what that means is that these varieties are very good at putting on carbohydrates and starches, and these build structural resilience, but those carbohydrates and starches don't, there's not a one-to-one relationship with minerals and phytochemicals. So for every one unit of carbohydrates you don't get 1 unit of antioxidant or other minerals. It's not a one-to-one relationship. So these are typically nutrient poor or less nutrient dense crops. They are treated with preserving agents often because they have to travel long distances from where they're picked to where they're going to ultimately end up in a grocery store. They do at times contain pesticide and herbicide residues. Now, these residues are below the toxicity limit as set by the EPA, but they do still exist. There's also the possibility of heavy metal residue on these as well, especially cadmium, which is a part of synthetic fertilizers. We don't see that as much in greens and fruit, but it is definitely present in grains because it gets incorporated. There's also issues with or challenges with possible contamination. So we've heard usually about every few months we hear of some contamination either with E. coli or salmonella or some other organism that is so there's a recall on the crops that are produced. So as well as being less nutrient dense or lower nutrient quality, you have to contend with all these residues and other potential pathogens on there. On the other hand, locally produced local and organically produced produce, there's an increase in variety usage. So a lot of farmers, especially like me, we rely on more of the heirloom varieties. They typically have a greater nutrient profile and better taste content across I think some of the more elite varieties, they're typically harvested less than 7 days before they go to market. No pesticide or herbicide residue, no heavy metal residue. They are less likely to these harmful pathogen contaminations. And as I said earlier, that they have greater potential and nutrient content. And here are just a few of the crops that actually came from my home farm that we've produced, and we're 100% chemical free. So next slide. Okay, so now what does this all mean? So we know that there's a difference in the nutrient quality and the residues that are present. So how does that affect the gut microbiome? So we know that the gut and the soil microbiome actually share very similar bacteria species. And that's because, and then another thing to think about is that there are 10 times more bacterial cells in humans than there are actually human cells, and the majority of which reside in the gut. So the microbes that are on the fruits and salads or on the phytosphere of vegetables inoculate the human gut microbiome. So you are what you eat. So when you take these in, you are actually inoculating your own gut microbiome. So when you take in pesticides or herbicides, there's a chance that you could be eliminating microbes or altering your gut microbiome. The plant microbiome can significantly influence the gut microbiome and thereby overall human health. So here we see in the figure of the difference between regenerative and industrial methods. We know the science tells us that we see greater microbial abundance and functional relevance in regenerative agriculture versus industrial agriculture. So it would only make sense that it would pertain to what our gut health looks like. Okay, next slide. Okay, so for a minute, I'm going to take my scientist hat off and put my farmer hat on. And this is what I would like for folks, or for you to kind of take away from this part of my talk. As a consumer, I would love to see more increased participation, especially in your regional food kit. Talk to your farmer, ask them questions about the varieties that they're growing. If you don't know what something is, by all means, ask them. Ask them what their management practices are. Ask them how far their farm is. Ask them where their farm's located. Ask them their management practices. Most of us would love to share that with you. Market managers, I think in my experience, we need to have more inclusion, especially of folks that are beginning farm operations. But this lack of being able to get into viable markets becomes a barrier to your success. And we definitely experienced that our first year of not being in very many markets and trying to get into markets. I do think that there's room for a number of farms to be included. I think there should also be a call for state and local agencies to increase support for food insecure areas. The fact that we grow enough food, we should be able to get into these areas where folks really are in need of it, that don't have access to a grocery store. A great example of that is Colorado with the sugar tax that they use to encourage folks to participate in farmers market. And lastly, the farmer-to-farmer contact or collaboration. I would love to see more increased knowledge sharing and collaboration, because I think sometimes we view each other as competitors. Instead, we are all trying to feed folks good food. So with that said, I'll turn this over to Jasia. Thanks for your time.
Hi, and welcome everyone. I too thank the Illinois Stewardship Alliance for this opportunity for us and for just the opportunity to be able to be with you. My name is Jasia Steinmetz. I'm a professor from the University of Wisconsin-Stevens Point, and I'm a researcher. I also direct the dietetics program, and I also teach undergrad and graduate courses. We also have a Bachelor of Arts degree in Sustainable Food and Nutrition. And my early career was in clinical practice, and so I really appreciate that health outcome side that Anya was talking about. It's really difficult for us at that stage to be able to kind of reverse engineer and get people back to that state of health where we could actually do some really thoughtful intervention. And so a lot of my work as clinical was to support people through that healing process or make sure that their disease didn't progress. And I really appreciated that work, just to be able to see and appreciate all of those diseases that Anya was talking about, and seeing that in different patients with different chronic disease under different conditions, and just knowing how important it is that what the practice that I was doing with having conversations with people about their food choice made a difference. From that, I moved into community nutrition, and my early research was in vitamin A deficiency in the international world and looking at communities and their vitamin A sources and what they were doing with that, and beta carotene sources, and trying to figure out and assess what was going on in the community, getting them ready for, again, some preventive intervention for that. I focus now on sustainable food systems and community development. And so I'd like to talk about now what consumers can do and have the power of change. I'm going to change the kind of view of consumers as economic consumers as much as what both Anya and Carl were talking about is you are what you eat. That is, you are consuming something and paying attention to what you consume. And along with all of the healing processes that you do, very much the cells that you're supporting, the trillions of cells that you're supporting, and the billions of cells that you replace daily do require you to be able to eat well on an everyday basis. And so it's the eating pattern that counts. And it does turn out, as Carl mentioned, with those choices within the food system, you are voting for a food system. And in fact, every time you vote, it has rippling effects, and those rippling effects go out into the community, into the region, into the nation, and actually globally. So very powerful choices that you're making. Just to kind of review, everybody is familiar with the basic food groups. We've had this either at My Period and now as My Plate. I would invite you to go to this website or My Plate Plan so that you can see by entering this data that you have, your personal data. It will calculate how many calories are recommended for you, but most importantly, the servings that you would need in every food group. And when you download the My Plate Plan, you get this really nice handout where you can track that. That's one way that we can support you in making those really good choices to meet your nutrients. Really important for making sure that you're well nourished. And this is based on science that gets reviewed every 5 years and adapted with updates. So you can be sure that that's solid. But we also know that it's really difficult to make choices in the current food system. And that is because the current food system is actually dominated with ultra-processed foods. 73% of the food that we have is ultra-processed in the US. Half of those calories that we're eating and more are taken up with ultra-processed foods. So the way that both Carl and Anya was talking about kind of this stripped down version that we have of soil, or stripped down version that we have of ecosystems and what happens in your gut when you eliminate all the bacteria, we can kind of think of ultra-processed foods as a stripped down version. It's engineered from whole food into parts of food. It has chemicals that are added to make it hyper palatable. It's inexpensive. It has a long shelf life. And so it's engineered food that you could not possibly make at home. And you can see this by looking at the ingredient list or being able to look at the food itself that doesn't look like food, but it's created out of food at some point. So the choices that you have on the right-hand side are ultra-processed foods. Much of the plastic food, the packaged food is ultra-processed. And a very active research is happening now to look at ultra-processed food and adverse health outcomes. And here are some that we've identified and continue to identify. In fact, there was just a major study that was done, a meta-analysis that was done in a few weeks ago that continues to support that this is not the food system that is going to support health as everyone has described so far. And so what we want to take is what is occurring with My Plate, really good information about how to have that daily eating pattern with all those food choices, eating a good variety of foods within those food choices, food groups that we have, making sure that those foods are whole foods as much as possible, or minimally processed foods, what Anya was talking about with fermented foods like sauerkraut, etc. foods that you can make at home, actually. And by definition, then those would be less fat, sugar, and salt, which we know are detrimental to health. But what we're proposing is that we extend that just a little bit farther with talking about sustainable MyPlate. That is, what eating patterns actually support that very dynamic, healthy microbiome that we've been talking about, both in the gut and in the soil, to support sustainable food systems, resilience, both for the human body and for the ecosystem, so that all living things in the ecosystem also can have resilience, and how Anya was describing how all of that is connected in her farm system. And then how we can be creating this new food system of the future. So what does soil microbiome to gut microbiome mean for us for a sustainable MyPlate? New research has also given us this very comprehensive and increasingly complex gut-brain axis. The gut is actually signaling the brain, and the brain is actually signaling the gut. And this has become really complex. And again, we're starting to look at research that details this. But the soil complexity in the system that Carl has described, and how we're just learning all of the connections that's happening, and the really rich microbial content that's there, you can think of your gut as the same way. So the gut is kind of like your very rich farm that you have that's supporting all of the things that are happening in your body. So if we thought about the gut as carefully and protected it as much as we did the brain, we would be much healthier, as Anya was describing. And so you can see that the gut is involved with creating all kinds of compounds that end up affecting all of these different parts of the body, all of these systems. So when Anya was describing how each system is connected to each other, and how when you have a system that starts suboptimally operating, it's going to affect everything else in the system. Or when Carl is talking about if you're doing this to the soil and it starts having all of these cascading effects in decreasing soil structure, then what we need to do to support that is to make sure that the gut microbiota is really very healthy. And we do that with whole foods. And it's the components of whole foods that really help the gut microbiota and provide maximum nutrients for us. And that's really what we're promoting, is really looking at where does your food come from and how do you actually support yourself for maximum health, maximum resiliency. And so we can eat whole foods. Prebiotics then are the food that comes for the microbes that come out of this whole food. As they digest it, they get carbohydrates, they get polyphenols, those phytochemicals that are so important for us are also important for the microbiome. This is, instead of stripping down our food system, it's taking all of that complexity of food that is grown outside in these organic regenerative farms and eating that food, and then having this very robust and complex system within our gut, which supports the complexity of the human body. Probiotics are when you actually consume those microorganisms. Carl was referring to that when he was talking about, you know, the really good bacteria that are on the foods that you're eating. Anya was talking about that with yogurt and fermented foods, etc. All very supportive. We're not suggesting that you limit what you're eating, because in fact, there is abundance of all of these microbiome-friendly foods. These are vegetables, fruits, nuts, whole grains, and beans. And everywhere that you live, farmers are in your area, in your region, and they are happily producing this for you so that it's abundant for us. And if we eat seasonally, you would be able to see all of the variety, the very abundant variety that is available. So rather than have kind of the narrow food system that we have that is coming into a lot of the chain grocery stores, same foods that you can get all the time, a little bit of melons that might come in, or some other fruits that might come in. If you went to the farmer's market, you would be able to see all of this abundance of cultivars that Carl was talking about that have all these different types of kale, different types of garlic, all of this seasonal food that you're only going to get in spring or early summer or late fall or winter where I live. And it's this abundance that we think is really important for the abundant microbiome that you need. And it also supports soil microbiome. So your choices would be to take this very complex, but very healthy, very vibrant system and choose foods out of this system because it ends up to really support the complexity that you have in the human body. Now, the resilience comes from, we know that there's so many benefits in here and we don't even know how these are all connected. We also know that between the brain and the gut and lung microbiome and all of the other understanding that we have about the human body, very complex systems, just learning at that very detailed level how they're all connected, but total appreciation for how one supports the other. So where do you find this really good local regional food that's microbiome healthy? In Wisconsin, we have something called the Farm Fresh Atlas. Every part of the state has an atlas. This gives us a list of where the local farmers are. We're really supporting that you buy food that's close to harvest time, has the highest nutrients, phytochemicals, it's ripe, so it's tasty, it smells great, the color is vibrant, and etc. So it has all of these really good sensory characteristics. As Carl's mentioned, they support heritage varieties and also the local control of seeds by farmers to save seeds, to use those seeds, keeping those seeds in production, and that supports the local ecosystem. Anya was mentioning eating locally to support your health and that connection between local and health. Absolutely important for us to move forward. And then seeing the farmer as your expert, both asking questions about production, asking about those different varieties that are there, and getting some preparation tips. And I ask my farmers all the time what I feel are like really simple questions about what is this and what does it do, etc. And my CSA farmer, we had celeriac. One, it does not rot, so it stays in your fridge for a really long time. And I could not figure out what to do with it. And I just like chopped it up raw. And then I talked to a fellow dietitian who said, well, I just cook it. And I said, I've never cooked it. And she said, I've never had it raw. And so we're constantly describing, what we could be doing with this food. It would have been so much simpler if I would have just asked my farmer how to prepare it, because they probably would have given me a lot more recipe tips for that. And so now when we're teaching sustainability within our programs, we're really trying to bridge that by having a lot of communication with farmers markets, local grocery stores, etc., to be able to find and support these local regional foods. So I'm constantly pestering the produce person about, if these are local, let's have the farm labeled and let's label it as local to support that. Why? Because it turns out we're bleeding farmers. They're becoming extinct. Every time that we do the farm census every 5 years, what we're figuring out is we're losing more farms. In the last 5 years, we've lost 150,000 farms. That includes farmers and 21 million acres of land. The economic stress of trying to compete in this market that is ultra processed, very global, not connected to regional, means that farmers are becoming more and more stressed. They have heritage farms, and they're 3.5 times more likely to die by suicide. And I know in Wisconsin, we are really trying to get as much support out, but the economic support would be really important. And so we're going to talk about the local multiplier. It turns out that if we're choosing the conventional system, farmers only get less than 15 cents for every food dollar you spend. In Wisconsin, households on average spend $270 per week. If just 10% or $27 every week was spent on local food, wherever you live, at least in Wisconsin, farmers would be $65,000 million with more to spend. So we're encouraging local farms everywhere, local produce everywhere, schools, farm to school programs, cafeterias, wherever you are, being able to teach children how to grow, supporting the indigenous foods that we have, and also asking those to be in your grocery store. So thank you so much for that quick overview. Please come to our workshop where we can explain more things in depth. And I hand it over to Erin.
Thank you, Anya, Carl, and Jasia. This was an amazing presentation. I appreciate all of the information and detail that you provide to all of us. And in light of time, because there's a couple questions that I think would be really good to ask at the panel and get their feedback on. Quickly, this slide I think says a lot of things in terms of how you can see the visual connection of what we were discussing today, and that organic and regenerative agriculture is supporting the soil microbial health, and that through food, it supports human microbial health. So food is that connector for all of this, and what we're trying to do. In this last slide, next slide, please. I just wanted to highlight, we would love for you to stay engaged with us in this QR code. You're able to fill this out and share your information, and we can put you on our list, our email list, to keep you engaged on what we're doing. And also there's a space for you to write information, to ask questions. If you're interested in our work, want to learn more about our work, please fill this out and we will respond to you. A couple of things that are happening in this next year is that we are taking the work that we've done up to this point, the literary research and whatnot. We've created a survey, and the survey we're going to launch in the next probably 3 months, and it's called the microbiome around and within us, soil to humans, and it's really geared towards the healthcare population, healthcare professionals, and we are really interested in what you're interested in, what your known knowns are, what your known unknowns are, to help guide our work. And so again, fill this QR code out if you're interested in learning more about this survey. The second thing that we're doing this year is, we've mentioned a workshop. We're putting together an experiential workshop that is a continuation of our work over the last 2 years. In year one, we put together a class for our culinary medicine program that introduced agriculture and food systems to family practice residents. And last year we created an education program that we piloted at the medical school around Microbes Matter, the path to regenerative systems of farm, food, and health in the age of climate change. So we're taking what we've learned this far, creating a workshop to bring professionals in agriculture, food systems, culinary, academia, and healthcare together to see what's happening, but also engage and become active in the work that's being done. So I'm going to go to the questions really quick. To the panel, I've got 3 questions. But the first question is, I live in the Chicago region where outdoor year-round growing is unavailable to me. What do you recommend so that I'm not relying on grocery stores with produce with high food miles and less nutritional value? Is there anybody that would like to take that one?
I can start that off by saying there would be local meat that might be available, chicken, definitely, dairy, eggs, etc. So not just produce, but you can look and support local farmers with some of these other purchases. I know that Wisconsin does have year-round spinach production because spinach will survive frost, and some other ones are. And so I know that goes down into the Chicago area. So maybe you want to check out and look at where your produce comes from and choose as close to home as possible. All produce has to be having this, at least the state or country origin on it. And so you can make those choices. You might have more local produce that's been frozen. And so you might look for that as a strategy. Dairy definitely could be more local. Make sure that you check to see where your farmers are coming from and where you're buying it. So those are just some strategies that you can think about to get started. Fermented foods might also be produced locally. So check the labels and see where your local, pickles, sauerkraut, etc., are coming from.
Yeah, I would agree with that too. And there's a lot of winter greens that are produced year round in structure farming. So I would imagine somebody in your areas, there's some farmer out there that's using structures to grow stuff. And by that I mean like greenhouses or high tunnels. We grow year round. We don't quite have the winter that Chicago has. So I know the Midwest can be particularly brutal, but it is possible. And even also consider looking at microgreens. Like those are grown usually typically local, and those are, I mean, it's not the best situation, but they are grown. You do have a lot of local producers that do that. So
I think one other thing for the winter, once you get to know seasonality, is there are crops that will keep. So you can put squash, garlic, onions, beets last a long time in the fridge, etc. So I can put that in a room temperature cool place. Cabbage can actually be stored in a cool place and last the winter. So I think over time, I just got a little bit better with storage so that I can kind of bridge that gap a little bit closer to spring.
I was also going to add that in the Chicagoland region, in larger urban areas, there are winter's farmers markets, and the farmers have a lot of root crops, storage crops that they're selling, mushrooms. There's also apples. So there are products that are available throughout the year. And we got a note that somebody suggested localharvest.org to find CSAs and farmers markets, in addition to Market Maker, which is a platform through Extension, but Market Maker is another place to find farmers markets. We have another question. Not all population groups are able to purchase organic / locally sourced foods. What would you recommend when this becomes a barrier? Is it worth it for education to get whatever nutrient-dense food possible, or is it better to advocate for more systemic change, or both?
So I'm speaking now as a dietitian. We have so many great programs that support that population. For older adults, there's a farmers market coupon program. For pregnant and lactating women, the WIC has a farmers market program. You can use your SNAP dollars at farmers markets and farm stands. And that includes using your SNAP dollars to buy plants in the springtime so that you can actually buy vegetable plants and grow your own. There's also double up bucks that I have been promoted in farmers markets so that you get twice the amount. And those have been really successful with both supporting local farmers and also being able to really double the amount of money that people have for purchasing. So many products like that, or programs like that, have been really successful. Supporting those programs are really important. So the Farm Bill is SNAP benefits. So advocating for the Farm Bill and keeping those SNAP benefits strong and SNAP education would be really, really helpful. Making sure that your legislators know that you support these programs that reach out to people when they're having a tough time. So that's really important. And then community gardens are another place that people have been able to grow their own food and celebrate their heritage. And, for the price of seeds and for the produce that you get out of that, it's a really good investment, and then also good for kids. So those are some of the things that I know are happening in communities that really support that population.
would also add to, like, yeah, the farm market nutrition program that's usually supported by your state Department of Ag. If you can, so many times there's money put into those that it doesn't get completely utilized. We see that quite a bit, and farmers are always more than happy to support those, especially if they're programs that have quicker turnaround for payment. Also, I would say if you have a community development corporation that's in that area, working with them, we work with one, they write quite a number of grants to bring money in that supports farmers to go into those areas to bring food in. So, but it's definitely, unfortunately, it's a very large barrier to people being able to, have access to organically grown food is definitely income.
We have an organization called Central Wisconsin Farm Shed, and there was a big discussion when we started that. Our first priority is to support local farmers, and the next priority is to encourage them to have more sustainable practices. So without being able to work with farmers and supporting those farmers, it's really difficult to make those changes and, kind of work through those systems. The other part about food insecurity is that ends up being income security. So making sure that the minimum wage is better. It's really it's really looking at income rather than just also from that food system. So food insecurity, we really focus on how do we get better income, better housing, all of the other things that are going to help people. So that's really important. And then lastly is obviously farmers need our support. And so you can advocate in your grocery stores to say, how do we get more local food in the grocery store, that it's available to more places, and knowing that they have a customer base for that and that it's advertised well. Most people really like supporting local farmers, and then it's in a convenient place for people to pick that up. So some of the more strategies that we've been using.
I don't know if Erin knows she's muted.
You're muted, Erin.
Thank you. I was just sharing, we received a question asking about our survey, and the survey is not out yet. It will be launched in the next probably 8 weeks or so. And if you are interested, I encourage everybody to click the QR code and fill that out and write a note, and we will follow up with you and reach out for the survey and your other questions. We want to thank everybody for joining us today. We want to thank our presenters and the amazing job that they did telling their stories and helping us connect what's become our life's passion of the soil microbiome to the gut and human microbiome. Again, thank you. And with any questions, feel free to email us or fill out the QR code. Any last comments from our speakers?
Thank you for being here. We really appreciate your interest and your support and the change that you'll make in our communities and planet.
Yes, thank you so much for the support and for being here.
Yeah, likewise. Yeah, thanks for attending, and your questions are always great. So I really appreciate that.